Good morning, AP government teachers. Today I wanted to take a minute to make a quick video about an issue that a couple of people had sent me emails about. There's one of the things that's on this week's scope and sequence on the calendar that I made that's not directly covered in the government textbook, and that's the Schattschneider model of politics. So I wanted to do a brief little video, talk about what it is I use the Schattschneider model for, how long I spend on it, and what some of your options are with regards to this. So, long story short, the Schattschneider model basically views American politics as the expansion of a localized conflict into national conflict. So, the big idea here is that essentially you have escalation of conflict to various levels, eventually drawing the government's attention and drawing a governmental reaction. Now, this particular model, unlike the Laswell model, won't be directly tested on the AP exam. In my memory, at least, they've never directly asked about the Schattschneider model. The reason that I choose to teach it anyway is because the Schattschneider model is a really easy and fast way to introduce some of the topics that are covered on the AP exam. Specifically, I use this model as kind of a half class period introduction to the concept of linkage institutions and to the introduction of the policy agenda and some of the factors that lead to issues either ending up on the government's policy agenda or not. So while technically speaking, the Schattschneider model itself will not be on the AP exam, a lot of the issues that it brings up will, and I think this is the easiest way to accomplish those. So let's start off with going over the Schattschneider model itself, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I use it for in my class. This particular lesson, I usually teach the Laswell model and the Schattschneider model together in one 48-minute class period. So the Schattschneider model only takes about 15 or 20 minutes to introduce, and it's a good way to hammer home two really important concepts that the kids need to know. So the big idea behind the model is that essentially you start off in the far left-hand corner, the box in the left-hand corner, and essentially you have a private conflict among individuals. And this is a localized conflict. It can be between two people or three people or two groups of people. But the important part here is that it's just those people who are involved in the conflict. They have some sort of disagreement. This year, when I taught it last semester, I used the example of the baker who didn't want to bake a wedding cake for a gay couple. In that particular example, there's only three people involved in that conflict. Now, according to the Schattschneider model, this conflict will be picked up by linkage institutions and escalate into a national conflict. And so this is the part where you really want to tell the kids about linkage institutions if you haven't done so already. So what they need to know is that linkage institutions are basically the institutions in our system that connect people to government and government to people. So the big idea here is that we can't communicate directly with our government. If I call up my senator, Ted Cruz is probably not taking my phone call, but we do have avenues to communicate with our government, and government has avenues to communicate with us through these linkage institutions. Specifically, those linkage institutions are going to be the media, the elections process, special interest groups, and political parties. So if one or many of these particular groups picks up on an issue, this is going to bring the issue to a whole new audience. So in the case of the wedding cake that I was talking about, the media picked up on that issue, and now people who weren't even involved or weren't getting married or didn't want to buy a wedding cake now know about the issue and have an opinion on the issue. This draws public attention and starts to get the attention of the political parties, with various politicians coming out either in favor of the baker or in favor of the grooms that were attempting to buy a wedding cake from him. So you basically have conflict escalation from what started off as a minor conflict between a couple of people and expands into a national conflict. Now everybody knows about it. Everybody has opinion on it one way or the other. This is the process that Schattschneider called the mobilization of new actors. So people who aren't involved in the conflict in any way, they're just third parties, are now involved. They're going out there, they're protesting. They're posting reviews on Yelp for the baker's Yelp page. They're going out there and donating money to political causes, either in favor or opposed to the choice this baker was making. They're joining special interest groups like the ACLU, and basically a bunch of people who weren't involved in the conflict originally are now involved and are invested emotionally in this conflict. The next step basically is because so many people are getting riled up and because they've heard through these linkage institutions about this particular issue, if enough voters care about an issue and enough people are talking about it, it's going to draw the government's attention. And so at this point, if it's a big enough conflict, this will end up on the government's policy agenda. You'll see everything from Congress having hearings about it to members of the House or the Senate going out and making public statements one way or the other on this particular issue. Now, not every single issue that receives media or special interest group attention ends up on the policy agenda. So there's a couple of different factors that make it more likely the government's going to pay attention to your issue, or less likely, depending on the case may be. So those major issues that we want to focus on, and this is the second big thing the kids need to know, is that the government can only focus on a couple of issues at a time. And so your particular issue getting on the policy agenda is substantially more likely if you have a broad scope of the conflict. So if it's a conflict that applies to people beyond the parties involved, so it's something that's generalizable to the public, then the odds of the government paying attention to it are a lot better, and the odds of it ending up on the policy agenda are higher. So although the initial conflict was between three parties in our example, certainly it brings up issues of religious freedom or issues of protection of minority parties that are relevant to people other than just the baker and the two groups. In addition, your policy may or may not end up on the agenda based on what else is on the policy agenda. So this is what we call competing conflicts. So for example, if this baker and wedding case business had happened in the middle of World War II, or while the government was dealing with a major national crisis, it's a lot less likely the government would have shifted its attention away from one of those big issues and toward this much smaller, more localized issue. Last but not least, another big factor that determines whether something ends up on the policy agenda is the influence of the groups involved. So if you have big and powerful special interest groups or political parties basically having a say in this particular issue, that makes it a lot more likely that the government's going to pay attention to it. So if your issue has the backing of, the ACLU or the NRA, it's a lot more likely the government's going to pay attention to it rather than having the backing of the Audubon Society. No attack on birds, but they just don't carry the same weight that those other interest groups do. Last but not least, the government is going to make a choice as to what to do about this issue. Either they're going to make a policy change or they're going to maintain the status quo and they're just going to do nothing. Either way, we consider this to be a governmental action. So government taking action or refusing to take an action are both considered the government doing something for the purpose of this model. And based on what the government decides to do, that creates a group of winners and a group of losers. So somebody got what they wanted from government and somebody didn't. And this throws off the balance of power between the competing groups. So whichever group got what they wanted from government will become more powerful in future conflicts. Whichever group didn't get what they want from government kind of loses influence and loses power in the system. Now, usually at this point, the groups will kind of things will settle and this issue won't come up for quite a while. But it might be years, it might be months, it might be decades. But eventually, the losing group is going to look to relitigate their loss, and they're going to look to score a win, and the whole process basically starts anew. So the losing group regroups and begins a new conflict in an attempt to kind of gain back some of the power they lost in the initial version. So it's a pretty quick model to go over. I use it primarily because linkage institutions and the concept of the policy agenda are really, really important. You don't need the kids to know this model so well that they're able to redraw it from memory. They're never going to be asked to do that. But the concepts that politics is basically a conflict, that the linkage institutions are what determines whether something gets on the government's policy agenda, and that there are factors that make certain issues more attractive to government than others, are basically the big concepts the kids need to leave this lesson with. If you have any questions about the Schattschneider model or what to do with it, I highly recommend teaching it. I think it's a quick and fast way to run through this stuff. Takes, a quarter of a 90-minute class period and gets across some important stuff the kids absolutely need to know. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. You know where I'm at. Thank you.